I still remember the way the lights glinted across the glass cases at Marwood Jewelers, scattering diamonds of color across polished wood floors. For 15 years, those cases had been my pride. I knew every piece in the store, their weight, their cut, their imperfections. To me, they were not just jewels, but stories captured in stone. When my daughter Marielle joined the staff, I believed I was passing down a legacy. She was quick with customers, confident, and I thought perhaps she would grow to love the work as much as I did. The necklace arrived one Thursday morning, a piece valued at $2 million. White diamonds set in platinum, the kind of creation that silences a room the moment it's revealed. I handled it carefully, logging it into the records, locking it away. By evening, it was gone. The panic that swept through the store was like nothing I had seen. Police were called. Employees searched. The owner's face pale with fury. Hours later, an officer beckoned me to the back. There, in my locker, wrapped in a velvet pouch, was the necklace. My knees nearly buckled. I swore it wasn't mine. Swore I had never touched it beyond the cataloging. But the evidence lay in plain sight, damning and undeniable. At trial, the betrayal came, dressed in tears. Marielle took the stand, trembling as though her heart was breaking. Her voice cracked when she said she wished it weren't true, but that she had seen signs of my struggles, that maybe I had acted out of desperation. Then she lowered her head and whispered words that will haunt me until I die. I never thought my own mother could betray us. Her performance sealed my fate. The jury's eyes shifted from her to me, not with pity, but with judgment already decided. The sentence fell swiftly, 10 years in prison. 10 years for a crime I did not commit. 10 years stolen because of the daughter I had once believed would carry my name with pride. I walked out of that courtroom in chains, my heart heavy not only with shame, but with the unanswerable question of why she had done it. The cell door clanged shut behind me, and with it began the long unraveling of my life. The first nights in prison were filled with shouting mine. I screamed my innocence to guards who didn't care, to women who laughed and told me every soul in here claimed the same. My throat ached from the strain, but the silence that followed was worse. In those hours, my mind returned again and again to the years that had led me there. I thought of the nights I came home after a double shift. The soles of my feet blistered, my hands raw from polishing cases at the store and scrubbing tables at a diner. I remembered quietly setting aside food so Marielle could have an extra serving, convincing her it was because I wasn't hungry. I remembered the tuition payments that seemed impossible, but always found their way through because I refused to let her carry the burden of debt. Every sacrifice I made was supposed to build her a life stronger than mine. Letters from Lionel reached me less and less as the months passed. At first, he swore he believed me, promised to fight until the truth came out. But whispers spread in our neighborhood like wildfire. She was always too proud. You know those jewelers handle temptation every day. Rumors weighed him down, pressing cracks into a marriage already strained by absence. By the time I learned he had collapsed from a heart attack, I also learned he went to his grave convinced I had stolen. That knowledge broke me in ways the cell never could. The man I had loved for 30 years died thinking his wife was a thief. After that, I stopped shouting. The bruises from fights in the yard taught me that silence was safer. I folded myself inward, became another number, another face in gray. 10 years stretched ahead like a tunnel without light, but I learned that survival was not about proving myself to others. It was about conserving the fragments of dignity that had not yet been stripped away. And then came the whispers that Marielle was thriving. News traveled strangely inside those walls. Sometimes it came folded in the corner of an old newspaper left behind in the common room. Other times it slipped through in the form of careless gossip from guards. That was how I first learned Marielle had bought a mansion overlooking Lake Washington. The article was brief, just a photo of her smiling on the front steps with a realtor beside her, the caption boasting of a promising young woman building her future. My stomach clenched as I traced her face with my eyes. She looked radiant, confident, as though the years that had stolen my freedom had only polished hers. Other inmates whispered when they saw me staring. To them, it was proof of my guilt. How else could my daughter afford such a place unless the stolen necklace had been sold? I couldn't argue. Any word in my defense only sounded like excuses. At night, lying on the thin mattress, I imagined the halls of that mansion. I pictured chandeliers glittering above rooms filled with laughter. Rooms I would never see. I wondered if she told guests where the money came from, or if she buried the truth beneath wine glasses and polished marble floors. The ache inside me deepened until it became unbearable, and so I began to write. I borrowed scraps of paper when I could, smuggled pens from the library cart, and started journals that no one asked for. I wrote about the day the necklace arrived, the weight of its chain in my hands, the shock of seeing it in my locker. I wrote about Lionel's letters, about Marielle's testimony, about every lie that built my cage. Those pages became the only place where my voice lived without fear. I promised myself that if the world outside never cared for my truth, then at least it would not vanish with me. And still, as I filled page after page, the image of Marielle's mansion haunted me. A palace built on my ruin, standing proud while I faded behind bars. It was in those nights of writing that I began to wonder what would remain of me when the gates finally opened. The gates opened with a groan that echoed through my bones. 10 years had passed, and I stepped outside with nothing but a cardboard box of belongings, a few letters, my worn journals, and a sweater that no longer held its shape. The air felt sharper, brighter, almost foreign. I had dreamed of this moment for a decade, yet as the road stretched out before me, I realized freedom was not the same as belonging. There was no Lionel waiting, no home to return to. The house we had shared had been sold long ago. Neighbors I once greeted every morning had turned their faces away. The world had moved forward, and I was an artifact it had no use for. I rented a small apartment in a weathered building downtown, the kind of place where no one asked questions so long as you paid cash on time. The walls were thin. The plumbing groaned, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I locked a door from the inside and knew no guard would come pounding in. Finding work was harder. Each interview ended the same once they saw the gap in my history and the word that defined me, now ex-convict. It clung to me like a stain. Even in the grocery store, I felt eyes linger too long, as if they knew, as if the label was stitched across my chest. Still, I rose each day, made coffee in my chipped mug, and forced myself to believe I could live with dignity even in this new skin. I unpacked my journals and placed them on the shelf like a private monument, proof that I had not disappeared. It was on a gray afternoon, when the rain tapped softly against the window, that the knock came. 3 firm raps at my door. Unexpected. I opened it to find a boy, tall, with Marielle's eyes but not her guarded smile. "My name's Adrian," he said, hesitating as though unsure if he should be there at all. "You're my grandmother, aren't you?" The sound of that word grandmother stirred something in me I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I stepped aside to let him in. Adrian stood in my living room, shifting his weight as if the floor might give way beneath him. His eyes swept across the shelves stacked with my journals, lingering on the worn spines, then returned to me. He was 15, perhaps 16, but his gaze carried a seriousness I hadn't expected. "Grandma," he began slowly, as though testing the word. "Why did you go to prison?" The question landed like a stone in the quiet room. I had rehearsed answers for strangers, for employers, for landlords, but not for him. For him, I had nothing prepared. "Your mother told me you took something that wasn't yours," he continued, his voice uncertain, but it never made sense. "She doesn't like to talk about it. Whenever I ask, she changes the subject." I looked at him, his hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets, his jaw set with stubbornness that reminded me of Lionel. My chest tightened. He deserved the truth, but the truth would unravel the life he thought he knew. Instead, I motioned him to sit and opened one of my small wooden boxes where I kept loose stones, old practice pieces from the store. Adrian leaned in, eyes widening as I held up a sapphire under the light. "See how it changes color at different angles," I explained, placing it in his palm. "That's how you know it's real. A true stone doesn't need to pretend." His mouth curved in a half smile. "Mom never showed me anything like this. She says jewelry is just decoration, but you talk about it like it's alive." I wanted to tell him everything, that his mother had built her mansion on my ruin, that her tears in court had been lies, but I saw the boy he still was, perched between childhood and manhood, and I knew words spoken too soon could scar more than heal. So I closed the box and said only, "There are always more sides to a story than people let on. One day you'll see for yourself." Adrian nodded, but I could tell the answer wasn't enough. His curiosity had been awakened, and curiosity rarely sleeps again. A week later, he returned with questions even sharper than before. Adrian was sharper than I realized. He came back one Saturday carrying a folded envelope, his face pale but determined, without a word. He laid out several old bank statements across my kitchen table. The numbers jumped out at me immediately: large deposits, far beyond what Marielle could have earned working at Marwood Jewelers. And then the date the purchase of the Lake Washington mansion had been finalized, just weeks after my sentencing. "She told me the money came from an investor," Adrian said quietly. "But I found these in an old desk drawer at home. None of it adds up." I felt the blood rush to my ears. Proof cold? Printed proof of what I had always known? But it wasn't just evidence. It was my grandson, risking his mother's anger to seek out the truth. Not long after, another threat appeared. Clara Rowden, the store's retired bookkeeper, reached out after hearing whispers that I was free. She invited me for coffee at her modest home, her hands trembling as she poured sugar into her cup. "I should have spoken years ago," she confessed, eyes clouded with guilt. "That night, before they found the necklace in your locker, I saw Marielle leave with a velvet pouch. I thought she was taking it to the safe. Later, when I heard it was found in your things, I convinced myself I must have been mistaken. I was afraid to get involved." Her words sliced through me. If she had spoken then, perhaps Lionel would still be alive. Perhaps I would have been spared a decade of shame. Yet, looking at her, a frail woman burdened with her own regrets, I knew anger would serve no purpose. "Why now?" I asked softly. Clara's voice wavered. "Because I've carried the weight too long. And because your grandson deserves to know the truth about his family." Adrian listened intently, his young face set in grim lines too old for his years. He folded the bank statements back into the envelope with deliberate care. "This isn't over," he said, looking straight at me. And in that moment, I realized he would not let the truth stay buried. The days that followed Clara's confession stirred something in me I thought prison had beaten out fight. For 10 years I had swallowed my words, bent my head, and carried the weight of a crime I did not commit. But Adrian's determination, his steady gaze when he laid those bank statements before me, lit a flame I could no longer ignore. Together we began visiting old co-workers. Some were reluctant, their memories blurred by time and their loyalties divided. But a few admitted they had always found the case suspicious. One remembered how Marielle had been the only one near the safe that evening. Another recalled her sudden spending spree not long after. Each detail was a thread. And slowly, Adrian and I began to weave them into a tapestry too damning to dismiss. I decided it was time to look Marielle in the eye. I arranged to meet her under the guise of wanting to see her again, to mend what was left of our family. She arrived in her polished car, every bit the image of success. But when I casually mentioned that Clara Roden had reached out to me, her face lost its color. She forced a smile, but her hands tightened on her glass. Clara's memory isn't what it used to be, she said quickly. Don't put much weight on what she says. Her words confirmed everything. The truth sat just beneath her skin, straining to break free. That night, I wrote down every detail of the encounter, every flicker of her expression. I tucked it alongside the growing pile of Adrian's findings. Then, with a resolve that surprised even me, I called David Harlan, a local lawyer known for taking on lost causes. When he answered, I told him plainly I need to reopen my case. And for the first time in years, I felt like my voice carried weight again. Adrian came to me one evening, his face set in that quiet determination I was beginning to recognize. He pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed play. At first, it was muffled voices, the clink of glass in the background, then Marielle's voice, sharp and raised. You don't understand, Adrian. I had no choice. Your grandmother was already struggling. Everyone suspected her. It was easier this way, safer for us. Her words tightened my chest. But she wasn't finished. I was drowning in debt, she admitted, her voice cracking. Gambling, loans. If I didn't cover it, they would have ruined me. That necklace paid everything off and gave us a chance to live better. You think I wanted to do it? I did it for us, for our future. The sound of Adrian's voice cut through, steady and cold. You didn't do it for us. You did it for yourself. Silence followed. Then the scrape of a chair and the recording ended. I sat in stunned quiet, my hands trembling as I held the phone. It was not just suspicion now, it was her voice. Her confession, combined with Clara's testimony and the bank records Adrian had uncovered. The case had teeth again. David Harlan listened carefully when I handed him the evidence. His eyes, sharp behind his glasses, flickered with something close to hope. This is stronger than I expected, he said. It won't erase the 10 years you lost, but it can clear your name. I felt something rise in me that I hadn't allowed for years. Courage. The thought of facing a courtroom again chilled me, but this time I wouldn't be the one silenced. This time I would carry proof, not just words. I folded Adrian's hand in mine, gratitude overwhelming me. You've given me back my voice, I whispered. And with that, we began preparing to face the truth in court. Walking back into a courtroom after 10 years was like stepping into a nightmare I thought I'd left behind. The polished wood, the cold eyes of strangers, the weight of judgment in the air. It was all the same. Yet this time, I did not sit as the accused, but as the wronged. David Harlan laid out the evidence with steady precision. Bank statements tied the mansion directly to funds unaccounted for after the theft. Forensic experts showed how my signature had been forged on inventory documents. Each piece fit together like stones in a wall, and with each one, the structure of Marielle's lies began to crumble. Clara took the stand next. Her hands shook as she confessed she had once seen Marielle carrying the velvet pouch, and how fear had silenced her back then. She spoke of regret, her voice cracking under the weight of what she had withheld for so long. Then came Adrian's recording. The courtroom went still as Marielle's voice filled the space, her admission of debts, her justification that framing me had been for our future. By the end of the playback, Marielle sat hunched, tears streaking the face she had once turned so confidently toward the jury. When the judge declared me innocent, I felt no surge of triumph, only a quiet release, as though a chain had finally slipped from my shoulders. The gavel struck, and the same system that had stolen a decade of my life now restored my name. Marielle was led away to face her own charges. The mansion seized to repay what had been taken. I watched without gloating, only with the weary knowledge that the truth had at last spoken louder than her lies. And when I stepped out of that courtroom, Adrian was waiting. The days after the trial moved differently, as though the air itself had lightened. For the first time in 10 years, I walked through my neighborhood without lowering my head. Old acquaintances who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped to murmur apologies. Some awkward, some sincere. The stain that had clung to my name was gone, replaced with something steadier vindication. David asked if I wanted to pursue damages, to claw back every cent and drag Marielle's name further through the mud, but I felt no hunger for revenge. 10 years had already been consumed by bitterness. I would not give the next 10 to it as well. Instead, I poured my energy into Adrian. He visited daily, sometimes with questions, sometimes just to sit in the quiet of my small apartment. Together we shared meals, laughter, and the slow weaving of a bond that felt more like family than anything I had known in years. In him, I saw both the future and the peace of Lionel I thought I had lost forever. One evening, we drove to the mansion on Lake Washington. The windows were shuttered, the driveway empty, the grandeur stripped of life. Adrian stood beside me, his hands deep in his pockets, and asked if I hated it. I shook my head. It was never a home, I said softly, just walls bought with lies. We turned away together, leaving the hollow shell behind us. I knew then that a house could crumble, wealth could vanish, but truth remained. They stole 10 years of my life, I whispered, feeling the words settle into me like a vow, but not my truth. And truth will always build the only home worth living in.